If you had been standing on the ramparts of the Red Fort in the late autumn of 1783, you might have noticed a peculiar quality to the light, a sort of bruised, violet hue that clung to the horizon long after the sun should have burned it away. It was a season that began not with a bang, but with a silence, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over the dusty plains of Hindustan like a woolen blanket soaked in cold water. You would have seen the merchants in the Chandni Chowk adjusting their shawls, perhaps pulling them a little tighter than usual for a November evening, laughing off the chill as a passing whim of the gods, unaware that the world they knew was about to be gripped by a frost so deep it would pass into legend. The air, you see, had begun to taste of sulfur and dry earth, a gritty residue that coated the tongue and made the water in the brass lotus taste faintly of old pennies. And as the days grew shorter, the warmth of the sun seemed to retreat, leaving behind a pale, sickly disk that provided light, but no comfort to the bones of the city. You must imagine Delhi as it was then, a city of fading splendor, where the ghosts of the great Mughals still whispered through the marble corridors, even as the power of the throne flickered like a candle in a drafty room. The Emperor Shah Alam, too, a man of poetic sensibilities and tragic burdens, would have looked out over the Yamuna and seen a mist he did not recognize, a mist that did not rise from the water, but seemed to descend from the heavens themselves, thick and white and smelling of distant, burning mountains. It is strange, is it not, to think that a mountain in far-off Iceland, a place most in Delhi had never heard of, could reach out its icy hand across the oceans and the deserts to touch the heart of India. And yet, the Laki eruption had cast its shadow long and wide, throwing up a veil of ash that choked the atmosphere and turned the global climate into a chaotic, shivering mess. As you walk through the narrow lanes of the city in this narrative journey, you hear the sound of teeth chattering, rhythmic, staccato sound that joins the low lowing of the cattle and the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. The blacksmiths were busy that year, not just with swords or plows, but with making small, portable braziers, for the wood was becoming scarce and the heat was becoming a luxury that even the middle classes struggled to afford. You see a family huddled around a single flame, the shadows dancing against the mud-plastered walls of their home. Their eyes are wide, reflecting the flickering orange light, and they speak in hushed tones of the Asman Kimar, the strike from the heavens. They tell stories of birds falling dead from the trees, their tiny hearts stopped by the sudden plunge in temperature, and of the marigolds in the gardens turning black and brittle overnight, as if scorched by an invisible fire that brought only ice. The Ganges, that great, pulsing artery of the subcontinent, began to slow its pace, not because the water was drying up, though the rains had been poor, but because the very edges of the river were beginning to stiffen. Can you picture it? The holy river, usually a tea-colored rush of life and ritual, becoming fringed with a jagged lace of white. The boatmen at Varanasi and Allahabad staring in disbelief at the slush that clogged their oars, a substance they had no name for, a slush that crunched and crackled like broken glass. It was a time of portents and whispers, where the astrologers sat in their high towers and pored over ancient charts, trying to find a reason why the sun had lost its bite, and why the nights had become so long and so very, very cold. You walk further into the countryside, away from the stone walls of the city, and the silence here is even more profound. The fields, which should have been lush with the winter crop, are stunted and pale, the wheat stalks bowing under the weight of a heavy rime that glitters like diamonds in the moonlight. But there's no joy in this beauty, for the farmers know that this glitter is the sheen of death. The frost has bitten deep into the soil, freezing the roots and turning the promise of a harvest into a memory. You see a farmer, a man whose skin is like parched leather, standing in the middle of his field at midnight. He is wrapped in a tattered quilt, his breath coming in ragged puffs of steam that look like tiny clouds in the darkness. He touches a leaf and it snaps off in his hand. A clean, sharp break that sounds like a bone snapping. And he knows, in that moment, that the year 1783 will not be remembered for its battles or its kings, but for the hunger that is surely coming. The air in the evenings grew so thin and sharp that it felt like inhaling needles. You would find yourself coughing a dry, racking sound that echoed through the empty courtyards of the mosques and temples. The dogs, usually so bold and territorial, now huddled together in great, shivering piles in the lee of the walls, their coats matted with frost, their barking replaced by a low, mournful whimpering that seemed to underpin every hour of the night. Even the elephants in the royal stables felt the change. Those great, gray mountains of flesh swayed uneasily, their trunks tucked close to their chests, their mahouts frantically piling blankets and straw around them to keep the mountain chill from reaching their hearts. In the markets, the price of charcoal began to climb, rising with the sun and never quite settling back down. You see the haggling, usually a spirited affair of wit and theater, turned desperate and sharp. A woman offers a silver anklet for a basket of coal. A man trades his finest turban for a bundle of dry sticks, for in this winter, fire was more than a tool. It was the only thing standing between the living and the transition into a cold, eternal sleep. You smell the smoke. It is everywhere heavy, acorn-scented haze that hangs low over the rooftops, trapped there by the cold air above, creating a ceiling of gray that makes the city feel like a vast, subterranean tomb. And what of the travelers? Those brave souls on the Grand Trunk Road, moving between the great cities of the north. They tell of nights where the campfire seemed to suck the warmth out of the air rather than providing it. They speak of waking up to find their water skins frozen solid, a heavy weight of ice that they had to melt over a slow flame before they could drink. And of the horses, their nostrils rimmed with white, their eyes wide with the terror of the unknown. You see them huddled under the banyan trees, the great roots of the trees looking like frozen serpents in the half-light. And you realize that the geography of India was changing, not in its maps, but in its very soul, as the warmth that had defined it for millennia was stripped away by a cosmic coincidence. The historians of the time, writing in their fine Persian script, began to record things that sounded more like poetry than chronicle. They wrote of the year of the iron ground, and of how the ink in their wells would freeze during the night, requiring them to thaw it over a lamp before they could continue their grim accounts. They recorded the deaths of the elderly and the very young, those whose inner fires were too weak to withstand the external siege, and they wrote of the strange, pale aurora that some claimed to see in the northern sky, a ghostly dance of green and red that terrified the populace, for such things belonged to the lands of the mountain men, not the plains of the south. You sit now in your imagination on a stone bench in a quiet corner of a Mughal garden. The fountain is silent, the water in its basin a thick, dark pane of ice that has trapped a fallen rose petal in its center. The air is so still you can hear the heartbeat of the world, a slow, thumping pulse that seems to be fading, and you feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on you. The realization that this was a moment where humanity was reminded of its fragility. The fires of Delhi were many, but they were small against the vast, encroaching dark. And as the first part of our journey draws to a close, the sun is setting once more, a pale peach smear against a sky of cold slate, leaving us to wonder how many would survive to see the dawn of the next, even colder day. It is a melancholy thought, is it not, that the things we take for granted, the warmth of the sun, the flow of a river, the predictable turn of the seasons, can be snatched away by a breath of wind from a distant land. But as you watch the shadows lengthen over the frozen Yamuna, you also see the flickers of resilience, the way a neighbor shares a glowing ember with another, the way a mother tucks her child deeper into the folds of her sari, the way the city, despite the frost, refuses to be silent. This was the beginning of the great test. The winter of 1783 was just starting to show its teeth, and the story of how India endured is written in the frost that we now see creeping across the window panes of history. Take a breath. Can you feel it? That sharp, crisp tang of frozen air. It is the smell of a world standing still. The bells of the temples ring out, but the sound is brittle, as if the bronze itself might shatter if struck too hard, and the call to prayer from the minarets seems to hang in the air, frozen in time, a plea for warmth that the heavens seem, for now, unwilling to answer. We will stay here for a while, in this twilight of ice and ash, watching the fires of Delhi struggle against the night, for there's much more to tell of this frozen era, of the famine that followed the frost, and of the way the landscape itself seemed to mourn the loss of its heat. The stories of the elders tell us that during this time, even the tigers of the Terai grew bold, driven by a desperate cold that made them forget their fear of man. They were seen prowling near the edges of villages, their breath steaming, their golden eyes searching for any source of warmth. It was a world turned upside down, where the hunter and the hunted were united by a single, desperate need. And as we look out over the plains, we see the flickers of 1,000 small fires, like stars fallen to earth, each one a tiny act of rebellion against the encroaching winter. You see the way the light glints off the frost-covered domes of the mosques, turning the city into a dreamscape of silver and shadow. It is beautiful in a terrifying way, a reminder that nature's most destructive phases often possess a haunting, ethereal grace. The streets are empty now. The people retreated into the heart of their homes, seeking the comfort of skin and breath, and as the wind begins to pick up, a low, whistling sound that weaves through the lattices of the stone windows, we prepare ourselves for the long night ahead. The winter of 1783 was not just a season. It was an epoch of ice, a trial by frost that would leave an indelible mark on the memory of the land, and we are here to witness it, one shivering breath at a time. As the hour grows late, the stars seem to burn with a fierce, cold intensity. They are like chips of ice scattered across a velvet cloth, distant and uncaring. You might imagine that they are watching us, wondering how these small, warm creatures will fare in the face of such a monumental chill. But there is no answer from the heavens, only the steady, relentless drop in temperature and the creeping frost that has now reached the very heart of the city. The fires are burning low, the wood is nearly gone, and the coldest part of the night is yet to come. But we will wait, you and I, in the shadows of the past, for the story of the frost is only just beginning to unfold. Think of the textiles, the famous muslins of India, so light they were said to be woven from air. How useless they must have felt against this new, iron reality. The weaver's fingers were too stiff to work the looms, the delicate threads snapping in the dry, cold air. Another industry, another way of life, put on hold by the whim of the climate. Everything was slowing down, turning inward, waiting for spring that felt like it might never come. And in that waiting, there's a profound sense of shared humanity, a recognition that regardless of rank or wealth, we are all subject to the great cold. We close our eyes for a moment, listening to the crackle of the last few logs in the fireplace. It is a comforting sound, but it carries an edge of anxiety, for we know that when the fire goes out, the frost will be waiting at the door. It is a presence, a physical weight that pushes against the walls, seeking any crack or crevice to enter and reclaim the space. And so we stay close to the light, cherishing the warmth while it lasts, and preparing ourselves for the next chapter of this icy chronicle. The Ganges is waiting, the frost is deepening, and the history of 1783 is written in the ice that now covers the world. The mist is thickening now, a white wall that hides the horizon and makes the world feel small and intimate. It is a world of whispers and shadows, where the only thing that matters is the next breath and the next spark of fire. We have walked through the streets of Delhi. We have seen the frozen fields and the shivering animals, and we have felt the bite of the sulphurous air. We are part of this history now, witnesses to a winter that defied the very nature of the land. And as we rest here, in the quiet of the past, we know that the story of the frost is far from over. It is a long, cold road ahead, but we will walk it together, through the snows of Hindustan and the ice of the holiest river. So, let the fire burn a little longer. Let the stories of the elders fill the air, and let the memory of the warmth sustain us through the dark. The winter of 1783 is here, and it has much more to teach us about the strength of the human spirit and the fragile beauty of the world we inhabit. Stay with me, for the night is long, and the frost is only just beginning to settle over the heart of India. As the midwinter of 1783 deepened, the air over the northern plains of India did not merely grow cold. It became a physical weight, a crystalline pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from the soil. You would have woken in a small village outside the walls of Delhi to a sound that shouldn't exist in the subtropics, the sound of the earth groaning. It was the frost, reaching fingers of ice deep into the loam, expanding and cracking the parched ground until the footpaths felt like walking on jagged iron. If you reached down to touch the dust, it no longer felt like the soft, warm powder of the Hindustani summer. It was cold, gritty, and lifeless, sucking the heat from your fingertips as if the earth itself had become a hungry ghost. You see the cattle first, their ribs casting long, sharp shadows against their hide, their breath rising in thick, rhythmic plumes that look like smoke from a dying fire. The fodder had failed weeks ago, the lush grasses of the monsoon having been seared not by the sun, but by a wind that blew from the north, carrying the dry, icy kiss of the Himalayas. The farmers, men whose lineages had tilled this land since the time of the Pandavas, stood helpless as their buffaloes lowed in a low, mournful frequency that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. There's a specific kind of despair that settles over a landscape when the natural order is inverted, when the sun, the giver of life, becomes a pale, distant observer, and the rain, the bringer of plenty, is replaced by a shimmering, deceptive rhyme that kills everything it touches. In the Havelis of the wealthy, the thick stone walls that usually provided a cool sanctuary from the heat had become traps of radiating chill. You would see the nobility, men who once spent their afternoons in silk tunics, fanning themselves with peacock feathers, now draped in heavy pashmina shawls and quilts stuffed with raw cotton, their faces etched with a confusion that bordered on terror. The braziers, or anjithis, were kept burning day and night, filled with precious charcoal that smelled of scorched earth and desperation. But even these fires were small victories. If you moved just 5 feet from the glowing coals, the cold would leap out from the shadows to grab your shoulders, reminding you that the architecture of India was never built to withstand a Siberian winter. Can you hear the sound of the wind? It wasn't the roaring gale of a storm, but a persistent, high-pitched whistle that found its way through the intricate jolly screens of the palaces. It played the stone carvings like a flute, a haunting melody that spoke of empty granaries and silent markets. In the city of Delhi, the nights were the hardest. The darkness lasted longer than anyone remembered. A thick, ink-black void where the only landmarks were the pinpricks of light from the watchmen's torches. Those torches flickered and sputtered, the oil thickening in the cold, the flames struggling to find enough energy to push back against the oppressive atmosphere. You walk with me now through the Chandni Chowk at midnight, the great thoroughfare of the Mughals. Normally, even in the dead of night, there would be the sound of a distant lute, the smell of frying parathas, the low murmur of late-night poets. But now, there's only the crunch of frozen mud beneath your leather sandals. The stalls are boarded up with a finality that feels like a burial. The homeless, the fakirs, and the laborers who usually slept on the open verandas are gone. Some have fled to the countryside in a vain search for warmth, while others have simply curled into themselves in the darkest corners, their bodies becoming part of the landscape of shadows. The water in the stone basins of the mosques has turned to solid plugs of gray ice. You see a bird, common sparrow, frozen mid-perch on the edge of a fountain, its tiny claws fused to the marble, a miniature statue of the winter's cruelty. It is as if time itself has been snap-frozen. The daily rituals of the city, the morning bath in the river, the washing of the courtyards, have become impossible, agonizing tasks. To touch water was to invite a pain that felt like a burn, a searing cold that left the skin red and raw. And then there was the smell. It was not the usual scent of Delhi. The jasmine, the dung, the spices, and the dust. No, the air of 1783 smelled of sulfur and old ash. The dry fog, the smoke cloud that had traveled all the way from the Laki craters in Iceland, hung low over the rooftops. It tasted of brimstone. It irritated the eyes and the throat, making everyone sound old and weary as they coughed through the haze. You would see people covering their faces with the ends of their turbans, looking like a city of veiled ghosts moving through a landscape of gray and violet. As we move toward the outskirts of the city, toward the great granaries, we see the true face of the winter. The Chalisa famine, as it would come to be known, was beginning to tighten its grip. The frost had destroyed the rabi crop. the winter wheat in pulses that the people relied on to survive until the monsoon. The stalks in the fields were brittle, turning to dust when touched. You see a group of women sifting through the frozen dirt, their fingers cracked and bleeding, looking for a few stray grains of bajra or a shriveled root that the frost might have missed. There's no talk here, no gossip of the court or the neighbors. There's only the grim, silent labor of survival. The trees, those ancient banyans and neem trees that had stood for centuries, looked like skeletal hands reaching for a heaven that had turned its back. Their leaves, usually a vibrant, waxy green, had turned sickly shade of bronze before falling in heaps that didn't rot, for it was too cold for rot, but simply shattered underfoot. You hear the occasional loud crack echoing through the groves. It is the sound of a tree limb snapping, the sap inside having frozen and expanded until the wood could no longer hold. To the people of 1783, these sounds were like gunshots, portents of a world breaking apart at the seams. You find yourself wondering about the animals of the wild, the tigers, the leopards, the wolves of the ridge. They were being driven by a hunger that overcame their natural caution. In the villages along the Yamuna, the people kept their fires burning not just for warmth, but for protection. You would see the golden glint of eyes just beyond the circle of firelight, predators drawn to the warmth and the scent of shivering livestock. The boundary between the wild and the civilized had blurred, erased by a common, freezing desperation. Back in the heart of Delhi, the Emperor Shah Alam II sat in the Diwan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience, once the most opulent room in the world, where the peacock throne had once sat, was now a drafty cavern. The emperor, a man of profound sorrow, who had seen his empire crumble and his own eyes blinded by enemies, felt this winter as a final, cosmic insult. He wrote verses in Persian about the ice that had entered the soul of the state. You see him huddled in a corner, his courtiers whispering about the price of grain in the distant provinces. Reports were coming in from Rohilkhand, from Oudh, from the Punjab. All of them told the same story. The earth was iron, the sky was brass, and the people were dying. The price of a single seir of wheat had risen to levels that made it a treasure. Gold and silver were being traded for handfuls of dry peas. You see a merchant, a man who once dealt in fine silks from China, now guarding a small sack of grain with a rusted tulwar, his eyes darting with a paranoia that the cold had only sharpened. The social fabric was fraying. The charity of the rich, which usually sustained the poor during lean times, was drying up as even the wealthy began to fear the end of their stores. And yet, in the midst of this, there were moments of strange, haunting beauty. You walk along the banks of the Yamuna as the sun begins to set. The ice on the river isn't a smooth sheet. It's a chaotic jumble of plates and shards that catch the dying light, reflecting hues of orange, gold, and a deep, bruised purple. The mist rising from the few patches of open water swirls in the wind, taking on the shapes of dancing dervishes. It is a cathedral of ice, a silent monument to a planet out of balance. You see a group of pilgrims, their saffron robes thin and tattered, standing on the frozen bank. They are from the south, men and women who have never seen snow, never felt a frost that could stop a river. They look at the Yamuna with a mixture of reverence and terror. To them, the freezing of the holy waters is a sign of the Kali Yuga, the final age of darkness and decay. They chant their mantras, their voices thin and trembling in the air, but the sound seems to be swallowed by the vast, cold silence of the plains. The nights grew even colder as January arrived. This was the peak of the frost. In the records of the East India Company, stationed far to the south and east, officers wrote of extraordinary frosts that killed their garden plants in Calcutta. So you can only imagine what it was like here, in the heart of the north. You feel the chill seeping into your very marrow, a cold that sleep cannot cure. People began to sleep in shifts, taking turns to mind the small fires, terrified that if they all slept at once, the fire would go out and they would never wake up. There is a story whispered in the bazaars of a family in the Parganj district who found a way to survive by huddling with their goats in a small, underground cellar. The animal heat, thick and musky, was their only salvation. When they finally emerged after a week of the worst frost, their hair had turned white, not from age, but from the shock of the cold. Folklore or fact, it captures the psychological toll of the winter. The world had become a place of narrow margins, where life was measured in the inches of wood left in the pile and the few remaining grains in the jar. You look at the light again, that strange, filtered light. Even at midday, the shadows are long and blue. The dust in the air, that volcanic ash from half a world away, creates a permanent twilight. It is as if the world is mourning its own demise. You see a kite, a scavenger bird, circling high above the city. It doesn't flap its wings. It simply glides on the icy thermals, looking down at a city that has become a graveyard of ambition. But even in the depths of the Chalisa, there is the human spirit. You see a baker, his oven the only truly warm place in the neighborhood, allowing children to sit near the vents, their small hands pressed against the warm bricks. He doesn't have much bread to give, but he gives the warmth, a commodity just as precious. You see a neighbor sharing a heavy wool blanket with a widow who has nothing. These small acts of defiance against the frost are the only things that keep the city from descending into total madness. As we reach the end of this part of our journey, the wind begins to howl with a new intensity, a lieu of ice, an oxymoron that shouldn't exist, but here it is, a biting, dry wind that carries the scent of the snowy peaks of the north. It rattles the shutters of the houses and tears at the clothes of the travelers. The frost is no longer just on the ground. It is growing on the walls, in the hair, on the very eyelashes of the people. The winter of 1783 has reached its zenith, and the heart of India is a palace of ice, waiting for a sun that seems to have forgotten how to burn. We leave the city for a moment and look back from a high ridge. Delhi, the jewel of the world, looks like a cluster of gray embers in a vast, white wasteland. The fires are so small from here, so insignificant against the backdrop of the frozen plains. And yet they are there. They are the evidence that life continues, however precariously. The frost is deep, the earth is iron, and the harvest is hollow. But the story is not over. We have much further to go through this landscape of ice and memory, to see how the thaw finally came, and what it left behind in the mud of the Ganges. The silence settles over us again, heavy, cold silence that demands respect. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the bite of the air, and you realize that you are no longer just a listener. You are a survivor of the great frost. The shadows are moving, the ice is thickening, and the long, cold night of the 18th century continues. The river, you see, was supposed to be the one thing that never changed, the one constant in a land of shifting dynasties and ephemeral seasons. But by the middle of January 1784, the Yamuna had become a stranger to the people of Delhi. If you were to walk down the stone steps of the Nigambad Ghat in the pre-dawn darkness, you would find that the air did not just chill you, it hollowed you out. The mist was no longer a gentle veil. It was a thick, suffocating shroud, a dry fog so dense that it swallowed the light of the oil lamps before they could reach the water's edge. You would hear the sound of the river before you saw it, but it wasn't a rhythmic lap of waves. It was a metallic grinding, the sound of ice floes jostling for space in a current that had grown thick as honey. Can you imagine the confusion of the priests? Those men who had spent their lives performing the arti at the water's edge, now finding the holy river transformed into a jagged wasteland of gray and white. They stood on the steps, their feet bare against the frozen stone, for ritual demands bare skin. Even when the air is sharp enough to draw blood, you see them shivering, their saffron robes stiff with the rime that gathered on every surface, looking out into the gloom where the river should be. The water that remained liquid was a dark, obsidian black, steaming as it met the sub-zero air, creating a ghostly architecture of vapor that rose and twisted like spirits escaping a tomb. You move closer to the edge, feeling the treacherous slip of ice under your sandals. The riverbanks, usually teeming with life, the washermen, the bathers, the sellers of marigolds, were eerily silent. The few people who dared to venture out moved like sleepwalkers, their heads bowed against the sulphurous wind. You see a boatman, a man whose family had plied these waters for generations, staring at his vessel. The wooden hull was locked in a crystalline embrace, the water around it having turned to solid glass overnight. He reaches out a calloused hand to touch the ice, and the sound of his fingers scratching the surface is the only thing to be heard in the vast, muffled world. It is the sound of a livelihood frozen in time. As the sun struggles to rise, a pale, lemon-colored smudge behind the volcanic haze, the true scale of the river's transformation becomes clear. The Yamuna was not entirely frozen through, but it was choked. In the shallower reaches, the frost had reached the riverbed, turning the mud into a subterranean glacier. In the deeper channels, the ice formed in large, flat plates, like the scales of a great, silver serpent. You see the debris of the city caught in this frozen grip, a discarded garland of flowers, now looking like jewels in a display case, a piece of driftwood, a broken clay pot. Everything was preserved, held in a state of suspended animation by a cold that the people of Hindustan simply did not have a vocabulary for. There are stories from that winter of travelers attempting to cross the river on foot, a feat that sounded like a miracle or a nightmare. You imagine a group of merchants, desperate to reach the markets of the Doab, testing the ice with their walking sticks. The sound, a deep, resonant thrum, vibrates up through their bones. They move slowly, a line of dark figures against the white expanse, their hearts pounding with the fear that the river might wake up and reclaim them. To cross the Yamuna on foot was to defy the gods themselves, and yet, in the winter of 1783 to 84, the gods seemed to have retreated to the high peaks of the Himalayas, leaving the plains to fend for themselves. The Ghats themselves, those great stone amphitheaters of faith, had become treacherous. The spray from the river had frozen on the steps, creating a black ice that was invisible in the half-light. You see an old woman, her back bent by years of toil, trying to reach the water for her morning libation. She slips, her brass pot clattering down the stones with a sound like a funeral bell, but there is no one to help her. Everyone is locked in their own private struggle against the chill. The sense of community, so vital to the life of the river, was being eroded by the sheer physical demand of staying warm. In the temples overlooking the water, the bells rang with a dull, flat tone. The metal was so cold that the vibrations couldn't travel, the sound dying almost as soon as it was born. You see the smoke from the temple fires rising straight and thin, unable to penetrate the heavy layer of cold air that sat over the valley. The scent of incense, sandalwood, and camphor mixed with the biting smell of the Laki sulfur, creating a sensory experience that was both holy and horrific. It was as if the world was being purified by fire and ice simultaneously. You walk further south, toward the fields that line the river. Here, the ghostly Ghats give way to a landscape of white desolation. The irrigation channels, the lifeblood of the winter crops, were ribbons of solid ice. You see the farmers' children playing near the edges, their curiosity momentarily overcoming their cold. They touch the ice with wonder, for they have no memory of such a thing. To them, the world has been transformed into a fairy tale, but their parents look on with hollow eyes. They know that a frozen canal means a dead harvest, and a dead harvest means the Chalisa. The 40-month famine is only just beginning its grim march across the land. The wildlife, too, was drawn to the river, even in its frozen state. You see the tracks of wolves in the frost, leading right down to the water's edge. They were searching for the fish that had become trapped in the shallow ice, their silver bodies visible just beneath the surface like ghosts. The balance of nature had tipped. The predators were starving, their usual prey having perished in the first weeks of the great frost. You feel the presence of these invisible hunters in the mist, their hunger a reflection of the city's own growing desperation. At night, the river took on a different character. The ice would speak, a series of loud, booming cracks that echoed off the stone walls of the city. These were the frostquakes, the sound of the ice expanding and shifting as the temperature plummeted even further. To the people huddled in their homes, these sounds were like the footsteps of a giant, or the breaking of the world's foundations. You lie awake in your imagination, listening to that rhythmic booming, feeling the vibration in the very floor beneath you. It was a reminder that even in its frozen state, the river was a power far beyond human control. The sleepy historian in you notes that this wasn't just a local phenomenon. The reports from the British in Calcutta spoke of a profound and unusual chill that reached even the Bay of Bengal. But here in the north, it was a catastrophe. The political atmosphere was just as frozen. The Mughal court was paralyzed. The Maratha Confederacy was struggling with its own internal winters, and the East India Company was watching from the sidelines, noting how the climate was doing what no army could, breaking the spirit of the peasantry. You see the emperor's messengers, their horses' hooves muffled by the frozen mud, riding out to the provinces with pleas for grain that didn't exist. The horses were wrapped in blankets, their nostrils bleeding from the sharp air, their riders looking like bundles of rags. They were the last threads of a dying empire, trying to hold together a world that was literally shattering under the weight of the ice. As we sit by the river, the fog begins to lift slightly, revealing the far bank. Usually, You would see the smoke of 100 village fires, the movement of people and cattle. But now there's only a vast gray smudge. The silence is so heavy it feels like a physical presence. It is a silence that tells of villages abandoned, of families who have packed their few belongings and headed toward the city in the hope of finding food, only to find that the city is just as cold and just as hungry. Yamuna, the daughter of the sun and the sister of Yama, the god of death, was living up to her lineage. In this winter, she was the bridge between the world of the living and the world of the shadows. You see the funeral pyres at the Manikarnika Ghat, those that could still afford the wood. The flames were small and blue, struggling against the moisture in the frozen logs. The smoke didn't rise, it drifted across the ice, a gray finger pointing toward the heart of the river. It was a grim reminder that in the winter of 1783, death was the only thing that wasn't frozen. But even in this darkness, you find a small spark of humanity. You see a group of monks, their heads shaven and blue with cold, sharing their meager bowl of khichdi with a stray dog that has followed them to the river. They eat in silence, the steam from the bowl, the only sign of warmth in their world. It is a small act, but in the face of a planetary winter, it is a monument. It is the refusal to let the heart grow as cold as the river. The ice on the Ganges and the Yamuna would eventually melt, but the memory of those months would stay in the folklore of the North for a century. They would talk of the winter when the river slept, and of the frost that ate the sun. As we look out over the water one last time before the light fails, we see the reflections of the stars in the ice. They don't shimmer. They are hard, bright points of light, like diamonds set in lead. The world is a cold, beautiful, and terrible place, and we are just small observers on the edge of the great, frozen mystery. You pull your shawl tighter, the wool scratchy against your skin, and you feel the weight of the history we are walking through. It is a history of endurance, of the way the human spirit hunkers down and waits for the light, even when the light seems to have gone out forever. The ghats are empty now, the mist has returned, and the river is once again a ghost, a whisper of ice in the dark heart of India. We will wait for the dawn, but we know it will be a cold one, and the story of the frost has yet more secrets to reveal as we move deeper into the winter of 1783. Can you feel the dampness of the fog? It clings to your hair, turning it white with rime. It settles on your eyelashes, blurring your vision until the world becomes a series of soft, gray shapes. You are part of the mist now, a ghost in the history of the Ganges, watching as the ice continues to grow, inch by silent inch, until the very heart of the country is stilled. There is a particular kind of silence that descends upon a palace when its grandeur is stripped away by the cold, a hollow, echoing quiet that makes the marble feel like the walls of a tomb. As we move deeper into the heart of Delhi, leaving the frozen banks of the Yamuna behind, we find ourselves within the red sandstone walls of the Qila-e Mubarak, the fort of exalted happiness. But in the late winter of 1784, there was little happiness to be found. You walk through the vaulted gateway of the Lahori Gate, and the air here is even sharper, funneled through the high stone passages like a draft through a needle's eye. The guards, usually resplendent in their finery, are unrecognizable. They are bundles of coarse wool and felt, their spears leaning against the walls because their hands are too numb to grip the cold iron for long. You see the Emperor Shah Alam too not as the shadow of a god, but as a man defeated by the very elements. In the Diwan-i-Kaz, the hall where it was once written, "If there is a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this." The paradise had turned to ice. The silver ceiling had long since been stripped by invaders, but now the very air seemed to have been stripped of its soul. You see the courtiers huddled in small, miserable circles, their breath forming a collective cloud that hangs beneath the arched ceiling like a captive ghost. There are no poets reciting verses of spring gardens. The only sound is the low, rhythmic cough of the elderly and the crackle of the few remaining logs in the central brazier. The emperor's physicians, the hakims, are at their wits' end. They speak in hushed Persian of the Barid and the Abusat, the cold and the dryness that have thrown the humors of the world out of balance. They offer the emperor infusions of saffron and cinnamon, trying to kindle a fire in his blood. But even the spices seem to have lost their potency in this iron winter. You see the emperor reach out a hand toward a small flame. His fingers are thin, the skin translucent like parchment, and he shakes his head as the heat fails to penetrate his bones. To be a king in a world where you cannot even command the sun to shine is a special kind of torment. Outside the palace walls, the city of Delhi was beginning to eat itself. The Chalisa famine was no longer a threat. It was a reality. You walk through the streets of the Parganj and the Sabzi Mandi, and the smells have changed. The fragrance of roasting meat and spices has been replaced by the acrid scent of burning refuse. Anything that would catch fire was being used for warmth. You see people tearing the wooden shutters from abandoned houses, breaking down the very structures that sheltered them to survive another night. The desperation is a physical presence, a hum in the air that vibrates with the threat of violence and the stillness of exhaustion. Can you see the eyes of the people? They are wide and dark, sunken into faces that have become masks of bone and leather. There's a strange lack of noise. The starving do not shout. They conserve their energy, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that is heartbreaking to behold. You see a mother sitting on a doorstep, her child wrapped so tightly in her rags that the infant is invisible. She is not begging. She is simply waiting, waiting for a thaw that is nowhere in sight, or for the end of a hunger that has become her only companion. The dignity of the poor in the face of such a calamity is a heavy thing to witness. In the markets, the grain merchants, those who still have stock, sit behind iron-barred windows. You see the Kotwal, the city's police chief, patrolling with a band of armed men, his face set in a grim mask. He knows that the thin line between order and chaos is held together only by the cold. People are too frozen to riot, but that will change if the temperature rises even a fraction. The price of wheat is now measured in gold coins, a price that renders it a myth for the majority of the population. You hear the stories of people eating busa, the husks of grain, mixed with mud to fill their stomachs, a desperate measure that only brings a different kind of death. As we move through the narrow alleys, you notice the absence of the bishtis, the water carriers. Their leather bags are dry and stiff, for the wells are being guarded like treasuries, and the water in the smaller tanks has turned to solid plugs of ice that require hours of hacking to break. The daily act of thirst has become a labor of Hercules. You see a group of men gathered around a well, not with buckets, but with hammers and chisels, the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of metal on ice echoing through the street like a ghostly clock. ticking away the hours of the winter. The sleepy historian remembers the letters sent by the British residents in the outlying districts. They wrote of the miseries of the inhabitants being beyond description, of roads lined with those who had fallen and would never rise again. But in the city, the dead were often left where they lay for days, for the ground was too hard to dig graves, and the wood too precious to burn for cremations. You see the Doms, the traditional keepers of the cremation grounds, sitting by their cold pits, their faces shadowed by a grim irony. The fire that was their trade had become the most precious commodity in the world, and they had none to spare for the departed. But let us look away from the horror for a moment and find the small, flickering lights of resilience. You see a serai, a traveler's lodge, where the keeper has opened his doors to anyone who can fit inside. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the steam of a single, massive pot of lentil soup. It is a communal warmth, a huddling of the human herd against the predator of the frost. There is no talk of caste or creed here. There is only the shared warmth of shoulder against shoulder. You hear a storyteller in the corner, his voice a raspy whisper, telling the tale of Amir Hamza to a circle of wide-eyed children, his words providing a momentary escape from the biting air outside. And what of the animals? The pariah dogs of Delhi, usually so fierce and territorial, have formed their own packs of survival. You see them huddled on the leeward side of the mosque walls, a shifting carpet of fur and shivering limbs. They no longer bark at the passers-by. They look at you with a mournful intelligence, as if they understand that we are all in this together. The horses of the cavalry, those noble steeds of the Mughal and Maratha ranks, are wasting away, their coats growing long and shaggy in a desperate biological attempt to fend off the chill. They look like prehistoric creatures, ghosts of an era that is being frozen out of existence. The night falls again, and the dry fog returns with a vengeance. It is a yellow, sulphurous wall that turns the street lamps into dim, orange smudges. You walk through this fog, and it feels like walking through a dream where your feet never quite touch the ground. The sounds of the city are muffled, the ringing of a distant temple bell sounding like it's underwater. You find yourself at the Jama Masjid, the great mosque. Its vast red sandstone courtyard is a sea of white frost, the moonlight reflecting off the surface until it looks like a lake of silver. You see a few solitary figures prostrating themselves in prayer, their foreheads touching the freezing stone, a testament to a faith that even the Laki eruption could not chill. You feel the weight of the sulfur on your chest, a tightness that makes every breath a conscious effort. It is the breath of the volcano, a reminder that the world is a single, interconnected organism. A mountain screams in the North Atlantic, and a child shivers in a Delhi alleyway. The historian in you muses on the fragility of empires, how they are built on the assumption of a stable sun and predictable rains. When those assumptions vanish, the empire becomes a hollow shell, a collection of beautiful buildings that offer no protection against the whims of the cosmos. As we sit on the steps of the mosque, looking out over the silent city, we see the flicker of a single lamp in a high window of the palace. Perhaps the emperor is still awake, writing his poems of lament, or perhaps it is a servant, tending to a dying fire. The light is small, but it is there. It is a pinprick of defiance against the overwhelming dark. The winter of 1783 to 84 was a trial of the soul as much as the body, a time when the masks of society were stripped away to reveal the raw, shivering reality beneath. You pull your thoughts inward, seeking your own inner warmth as the temperature drops another few degrees. The stars above are so bright they seem to be screaming. They'll light a cold, silent fire that offers no comfort. The iron earth beneath you is unyielding, a reminder of the permanence of the world and the transience of those who walk upon it. But we are still here, you and I, traveling through the frost and the fog, recording the stories of those who lived through the year the Ganges froze. We will wait for the first light of dawn, though we know it will be a pale, cold thing. We will watch as the people of Delhi emerge from their hovels, their breath preceding them like heralds of the living. The story of the frost is nearing its peak, and the transition from winter to the hungry spring is yet to come. But for now, let's simply sit in the silence of the great mosque, watching the frost grow on the stones, and honoring the memory of a city that refused to die, even when the fires of Delhi never seemed warm enough. Can you hear the low, deep rumble of the city breathing? It is a slow, labored breath, but it is steady. The frost may have gripped the river and the ground, but the heart of Hindustan is still beating, hidden beneath layers of wool and stone and hope. We stay in the shadows, witnesses to the endurance of the spirit, as the long, cold night of 1783 continues its slow, majestic crawl toward the light. If you were to leave the city gates of Delhi in the early weeks of February 1784, heading toward the northern horizon, you would find that the Grand Trunk Road, that ancient, pulsing artery of commerce and conquest, had become a ribbon of white silence. The dust that usually choked the air, kicked up by the thousands of hooves and wheels that connected Kabul to Calcutta, was gone, replaced by a crust of frozen mud that crunched with a sound like breaking porcelain. You walk through this landscape, and the vastness of the plains feels different. The horizon is no longer a soft haze of heat and light, but a sharp, clinical line of blue and gray, where the air is so clear it hurts the eyes, yet so thin it feels as though you are breathing through a layer of fine, cold silk. You see a caravan approaching from the northwest, a line of camels moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation. These animals, the ships of the desert, were bred for the scorching sands of Rajasthan and the rocky passes of the Hindu Kush, but they were never meant for this iron-hard cold that turns their joints to stone. You see the frost matted into their thick, shaggy coats, their long eyelashes heavy with rime. The merchants leading them are unrecognizable, wrapped in layers of felt and coarse wool until they look like walking mounds of earth. Their faces are hidden behind cloths to protect their lungs from the dry fog, leaving only their eyes visible dark. Weary eyes that have seen too many frozen mornings and too many companions fall by the wayside. The sleepy historian in you notes that the trade of an entire subcontinent was stalling. The silk from Bengal, the spices from the Malabar coast, the horses from Central Asia, everything was caught in the grip of the great frost. You walk past the Sarai, one of those grand stone inns built by the emperors to provide shelter for travelers. Usually, these places are hubs of noise, the air thick with the smell of roasting lamb and the sound of a dozen languages. But now, the courtyard is a graveyard of abandoned carts and shivering beasts. You see the travelers huddled in the windowless rooms, their fires small and smoky because the wood is being rationed like gold. There is no music here, no boasting of profits. There's only the quiet, desperate calculation of how many days of grain remain in the sacks. Can you hear the sound of the frost on the road? It's a rhythmic, crystalline snapping that occurs every time a heavy foot falls. In the fields flanking the road, the silence is even deeper. The wells, those vital hubs of village life, have become treacherous monuments of ice. You see the Persian wheels, those ingenious wooden machines used to lift water, standing still. Their wooden cogs are frozen solid, and the buckets are encased in a layer of ice so thick that no ox could hope to turn the wheel. The water inside the wells is a dark, still mirror, several feet below a cap of ice that must be smashed daily with heavy iron bars. You see a group of pilgrims moving toward the holy city of Hardwar, where the Ganges emerges from the mountains. They are barefoot, their skin are bruised, purplish hue from the contact with the frozen ground. They believe that the cold is a penance, a divine cleansing of the world's sins. But as you watch them, you see one man stumble, his strength finally failing. His companions don't stop. They haven't the energy to spare. They simply chant their mantras with cracked, dry lips, their voices lost in the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. It is a world where the individual is shrinking, where the scale of the disaster has rendered the suffering of one person almost invisible. The village markets along the road are hollow shells. You see the vegetable sellers with nothing but a few shriveled, blackened roots that the frost has claimed. The price of salt, of oil, of the most basic necessities has climbed beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest. You see a zamindar, a local landlord, riding a horse that is little more than a skeleton covered in skin. He is out to collect his dues, but there is nothing to collect. The granaries are empty. The seeds for the next season have been eaten in a desperate bid to survive the night, and the land itself has withdrawn its favor. As we walk further, you notice the babool trees that line the road. Their long, sharp thorns are coated in a layer of translucent ice, turning them into crystalline sculptures that catch the pale light of the afternoon. When the wind blows, these trees don't rustle. They clink, a sound like 1,000 glass bells ringing in a cathedral of ice. It is a hauntingly beautiful sound, a melody of the apocalypse. You stop for a moment to listen, the cold air biting at your cheeks, and you realize that the beauty of the winter of 1783 was a cruel one, a beauty that existed only because the heat of life had been extinguished. The nights on the road were a descent into a private hell. You imagine yourself trying to sleep in the lee of a stone wall, the wind whistling through every gap in your clothing. You feel the cold creeping up from the ground, a persistent, leaching force that seeks to equalize your body temperature with the iron earth. You watch the stars, those hard, brilliant diamonds, and you feel a sense of cosmic isolation. The Laki eruption had not just changed the weather, it had changed the very atmosphere of the world, creating a permanent, sulphurous twilight that made the nights feel eternal. You see the dark runners, the postal carriers of the era, who move between the cities on foot. They are the only things that still move with any speed. You see a runner approaching, his bells jingling with a muffled, lonely sound in the cold air. He is a young man, his chest heaving, his breath a thick plume of steam. He carries the letters of the East India Company, the reports of the Mughal governors, the pleas for help that will likely never be answered. He represents the last flickering nerves of a paralyzed state, trying to send signals through a body that is rapidly losing sensation. In the distance, you see the outlines of a Bali, a magnificent stepwell. You descend the stone stairs, moving away from the wind. The temperature rises slightly as you go deeper into the earth, but the air is damp and heavy. At the bottom, the great pool of water is a sheet of black ice, reflecting the narrow rectangle of the sky far above. You see the intricate carvings of gods and goddesses on the walls, their stone eyes staring out at the frozen water. This was meant to be a place of refuge, a cool sanctuary from the Indian sun, but now it feels like a dungeon. The irony of the architecture is not lost on you. The people who built these wells were masters of the heat, but they had no defense against the cold. The sleepy historian muses on the ecological shift. The tigers of the Terai, the great grasslands to the north, were being driven south by the cold and the lack of prey. You see their tracks on the Grand Trunk Road, massive, deep impressions in the frozen mud. There are reports of tigers entering villages and dragging people from their huts, not out of malice, but out of a starving, freezing desperation. The king of the jungle was being humbled by the same frost that broke the spirit of the emperor. It was a leveling of the world, a return to a primal state where the only law was the search for warmth and food. You look at the sun as it begins to dip toward the horizon. It is a pale, sickly thing, providing as much warmth as a distant candle. The dry fog thickens, turning the sky into a bruised shade of plum and charcoal. You feel the onset of the night chill, a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that makes your lungs ache. You find yourself looking for any sign of human life, a wisp of smoke, a flicker of a lamp, but the villages are dark. The people have learned that to show a light is to invite the desperate, and in the winter of 1783, there was no charity left to give. As we stand on the edge of the road, watching the last of the camel caravans disappear into the mist, we feel a sense of profound stillness. The world has been stilled, caught in a crystalline trap from which there is no obvious escape. The Ganges is far to the east. The Yamuna is a memory of ice to the south, and ahead of us lies only the frozen expanse of Hindustan. We are travelers in a landscape of ghosts, witnessing the moment when the rhythm of a civilization was interrupted by a whisper from the top of the world. You pull your cloak tighter, your fingers numb and clumsy. The road is empty now, the only sound the distant, mournful howl of a wolf or a dog. It's hard to tell which in this distorted air. We will stay here for a while, in the shadow of an ancient banyan tree, its frozen leaves clicking in the wind, and we will wait for the next chapter of this icy history. For the winter is not yet over, and the thaw, when it comes, will bring its own set of sorrows. But for now, there's only the road, the frost, and the long, cold silence of 1784. Can you feel the weight of the history beneath your feet? The millions who have walked this road over 2 millennia, and yet none of them saw a winter quite like this. You are witness to a singular moment in time, a climatic anomaly that reshaped the destiny of a nation. The frost on the Grand Trunk Road is a record of that moment, a crystalline script that we are only just beginning to read. Stay with me, for the night is deepening, and the stories of the frozen roads have much more to tell us about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of the impossible. The wind picks up, carrying a fine, stinging dust that is actually tiny needles of ice. It scours the skin and clogs the throat. You turn your back to it, seeking the meager shelter of the tree trunk. The world is disappearing into a white and gray void, and you are alone with your thoughts and the ghosts of the caravan. It is a time for reflection, for wondering at the fragility of our systems and the power of the natural world. The winter of 1783 was a reminder of that power, a lesson written in frost and iron, and we are the students of its cold, silent classroom. By late February of 1784, the novelty of the cold, if such a terrifying thing could ever be called a novelty, had long since curdled into a permanent state of exhaustion. We leave the grand roads and the palace corridors now, turning our gaze toward the small, mud-walled villages of the Doab, the fertile land between the Ganges and the Yamuna that should have been the breadbasket of the north. But as you walk through the narrow lanes of these hamlets, you find a silence that is far heavier than the silence of the frost. It is the silence of the Chalisa, the famine that would claim millions and whose name would be whispered in terror for generations. The frost had been the sickle, and now the hunger was the harvest. You see the communal grain pits, the kadis, which are usually the pride of the village. They are open, their heavy wooden lids cast aside, revealing nothing but dust and a few scattered husks. The earth around them is scarred by the desperate digging of fingers, human and animal alike, searching for a stray kernel that might have slipped through the cracks. You see a village elder sitting on the edge of a dry well, his white beard matted with the yellow dust of the volcanic fog. He holds a wooden bowl in his lap, but he isn't begging. There is no one left to beg from. He is simply staring at the empty vessel, as if waiting for the laws of nature to reverse themselves and fill it with the warmth of boiled rice. The sleepy historian, and you notes the grim mathematics of the era. The price of grain had not just doubled or tripled. It had vanished into a realm of bartering that defied logic. You see a woman, her eyes like dark pits and a face of bone, offering her silver nose ring, a piece of her dowry, her last vestige of security, to a man for a handful of dry chickpeas. The man shakes his head. He cannot eat silver, and he knows that tomorrow his own supply will be gone. The social contracts that had held these communities together for centuries were snapping like frozen twigs. The Jejmani system, the ancient network of mutual obligation between the laborer and the landlord, was collapsing because the land had nothing left to give. Can you smell the air here? It is different from the city. In Delhi, the air smelled of sulfur and burning refuse, but here in the countryside, it smells of nothing. It is a sterile, cold vacuum, devoid of the scent of cooking fires, of livestock, or of the sweet, cloying smell of ripening wheat. Even the smell of death is absent, for the air is too cold for the usual processes of decay. The bodies of the fallen simply dry out, becoming part of the landscape of gray and brown, leather-like figures huddled under the thorn bushes. You see the vultures circling high above, their wings catching the pale light. But even they look thin, their scavenged meals providing little heat for their own survival. You move into one of the huts, stepping over the threshold into a darkness that is barely broken by the light from the door. You have to wait for your eyes to adjust. There's no fire in the hearth. The family is huddled together on a single mat, trying to share the heat of their bodies. They move very little. Hunger makes the limbs heavy and the mind slow. You see the children, their bellies swollen, a cruel irony of starvation. Their skin stretched tight over their ribs. They do not cry. The energy required to cry as a luxury they no longer possess. They simply watch you with a profound, unsettling stillness, their gazes reflecting a world that has become entirely alien to them. Outside, you see the ghost crops. These are the stalks of wheat and barley that the frost killed months ago. They still stand in the fields, bleached white by the sun and the cold, looking like a skeletal army. When the wind blows, they rattle with a dry, metallic sound that carries across the plains. You see a man trying to chew on one of these stalks, his teeth grinding against the fiber, trying to extract even a drop of moisture or a ghost of a nutrient. It is a futile effort, but the instinct to survive is a stubborn, irrational thing. The sleepy historian recalls the reports from the British collectors in the East, who were beginning to see the first waves of refugees. They called them living skeletons, and noted with a detached, bureaucratic horror that these people were selling their own children for a single meal. You see this happening in the village square. A father, a man who once took pride in a small plot of land, handing his youngest daughter to a passing merchant in exchange for a bag of coarse millet. There are no tears, for the body has no water to spare for weeping. There is only a grim, silent transaction, a desperate attempt to save at least one life at the cost of another. The wildlife has become a constant threat. The wolves, emboldened by the lack of resistance, move through the village streets even in the daylight. You see them sniffing at the doors of the huts, their ribs as prominent as the people's. They are the shadows of the famine, the reminders that when the human order fails, the ancient predators return to claim the ruins. You see a villager trying to throw a stone at a wolf, but his arm is weak, and the stone falls short. The wolf doesn't run. It simply moves back a few paces and waits, its yellow eyes fixed on the man with a terrifying patience. As the afternoon light begins to fade, turning the sky into a bruised shade of copper, you walk toward the village pond. It is a solid block of ice, the surface scarred by the attempts of the people to hack through to the water below. You see a group of women gathered there, their saris tattered and gray. They are boiling water over a small fire made of dried dung and thorns. Into the pot they throw gular, the wild figs that are usually considered fit only for animals, and bits of tree bark. It is a soup of desperation, a bitter, woody liquid that provides the illusion of a meal. They share it with a solemnity that feels like a religious rite, each woman taking a single, measured sip before passing the bowl. The nights in the village are a descent into a deep, freezing silence. There are no lamps, for oil is a memory. The only light comes from the stars, which seem to mock the darkness below with their cold brilliance. You lie on the frozen ground, feeling the chill seep into your soul, and you realize that the winter of 1783 was not just a weather event. It was the structural collapse of a world. The Laki eruption had pulled the thread, and the entire tapestry of Indian life was unraveling. The Mughal Empire, the Marathas, the rising power of the British. None of them mattered in the face of an empty bowl. You hear the sound of a nagara, a large drum, beating in the distance. It is the call of a local chieftain, trying to rally his people, or perhaps announcing a small distribution of grain from his private stores. The sound is muffled by the cold air, a slow, thumping heartbeat that feels like the last pulse of the land. People begin to move toward the sound, a slow procession of shadows shuffling through the frost. They move with hope, but it is a fragile, dangerous hope that can easily turn to despair when they find that the distribution is only for a chosen few. The sleepy historian muses on the long-term effects of this winter. The Chalisa famine would clear vast tracts of land, leading to the jungle reclaiming villages that had existed for 1,000 years. It would shift the demographics of the north, driving people toward the growing cities of the east. But for now, in the moment of 1784, there is no long term. There's only the next hour, the next breath, and the constant, gnawing pain in the stomach. The world has shrunk to the size of a single grain of rice. You look at the horizon, where the dry fog is gathering again. It looks like a wall of ash, a reminder of the distant volcano that started this chain of misery. It is strange to think that something so far away could have such an intimate impact on the lives of these people. A mountain in Iceland speaks, and a village in the Dobe falls silent. It is a lesson in the interconnectedness of our planet, a lesson written in the most painful of scripts. As we leave the village, walking back toward the ghost line of the Ganges, we see a lone tree standing in the middle of a barren field. Its branches are draped with small pieces of cloth, votive offerings to the gods for rain, for warmth, for food. The cloths are faded and frozen, snapping in the wind like tiny flags of surrender. The gods, it seems, are as cold as the wind. We continue our journey, the sound of the empty bowls echoing in our minds, a rhythmic, hollow sound that defines the winter of 1783. Stay with me, for the night is coming, and the story of the famine is not yet finished. We have seen the empty pits and the desperate trades, but there is still the question of how the land survived, and what grew in the mud when the thaw finally, mercifully arrived. The silence is deep, the air is sharp, and the history of the frost continues to unfold in the shivering heart of India. As the month of March 1784 began to bleed into April, the air over the northern plains underwent a subtle, almost treacherous transformation. The sleepy historian, in your notes that a thaw in a land devastated by frost is not a sudden joy, but a messy, uncertain labor. You would have felt it first not as warmth, but as a change in the wind, a dampness that replaced the needle-sharp dryness of the volcanic fog. The dry fog began to thin, and for the first time in months, the sun regained a ghost of its former golden weight. But as the ice began to surrender its grip on the Ganges and the Yamuna, the world did not immediately return to life. It turned to a landscape of gray, weeping mud. Can you hear the sound of the world melting? It isn't a song. It's a rhythmic, heavy dripping. The sound of the rime on the palace eaves turning to water and falling onto the marble with the sound like tears. In the fields of the Dobe, the iron earth began to soften, but it did not become fertile. Instead, it became a quagmire of cold, black sludge. The ghost crops that had stood so stiffly in the frost now collapsed into the mire, rotting in a way they hadn't been able to during the deep freeze. You walk through this landscape, and the smell of sulfur is replaced by the smell of stagnant water and old, wet straw. It is the smell of a world trying to remember how to breathe, but finding its lungs filled with silt. You stand once more on the banks of the Yamuna near the Red Fort. The great plates of ice, those silver scales of the serpent, are breaking apart. You hear the thunderous crack boom of the flows as they collide, driven by a current that is suddenly, violently alive with meltwater from the Himalayas. The river is a coffee-colored rush, carrying with it the debris of the winter, the frozen carcasses of cattle, the shattered remains of wooden boats, and the countless small, tragic bundles of rags that the frost had claimed. It is a funeral procession on a continental scale, moving toward the sea. The boatmen watch from the banks, their oars still idle, for the river is too chaotic, too filled with the anger of the thaw, to be navigated. The sleepy historian muses on the psychology of this moment. For the people of Delhi, the end of the frost brought a strange kind of mourning. In the deep cold, there was a clarity of survival. You found wood, you found a flame, you lived. But in the thaw, the true cost of the Chalisa became visible. As the snow and ice vanished from the streets, they revealed what had been hidden beneath. The sheer number of those who hadn't made it. You see the Kotwal, and his men moving through the city with carts, no longer looking for grain, but performing the grim task of clearing the streets. The silence of the city is no longer the silence of the frost. It is the silence of a house after a long illness. In the markets, the tension has shifted. The grain that was hidden away in secret cellars is beginning to trickle out, but it is damp, moldy, and ruinously expensive. You see a merchant opening his sack, only to find the wheat has begun to sprout in the humid air, green shoots of life emerging from a bed of decay. To a hungry man, these shoots are a mockery. You see the crowds gathered around the stalls, their faces no longer frozen masks, but twitching with the new, nervous energy. The lethargy of the cold is being replaced by the desperation of the damp. People are sick now, not with the lung bite of the sulfur, but with the fevers that follow the rising water. The sleepy historian notes that the great frost was merely the first act. The second act was the pestilence. You move toward the Emperor's Gardens, the Hayat Bakhshbagh, the life-bestowing garden. The fountains are no longer plugs of ice, but they remain silent, the pipes clogged with the grit of the volcanic ash. You see the Emperor Shah Alam too walking slowly along the marble paths. His feet are no longer wrapped in rags, but his gait is heavy. He looks at the rose bushes, which are black and skeletal. A few brave leaves are attempting to unfurl, but they are pale and sickly, lacking the vibrant strength of a true Indian spring. The Emperor stops to touch a branch, and it doesn't snap as it would have a month ago. It bends, limber and wet, but it feels lifeless. He's a king of a kingdom that has been hollowed out, waiting for a rebirth that feels a long way off. Outside the city, the silent caravans are starting to move again, but the roads are treacherous. The Grand Trunk Road is a river of mud that swallows the wheels of the carts and the legs of the horses. You see a line of bullock carts stuck in a rut, the drivers shouting and lashing the beasts, but the animals have no strength left. They collapse in the mire, their heads resting in the cold sludge, their eyes turning glassy. The trade that should have brought relief to the starving provinces is stalled by the very thaw they prayed for. It is a cruel irony that the sleepy historian records with a dry, melancholy wit. The winter froze the spirit, but the spring drowned the hope. Can you see the horizon? The dry fog has been replaced by a heavy, gray overcast. The sun is a bright spot behind the clouds, but it lacks the heat to dry the land. The humidity is rising, a thick, cloying blanket that makes the wet clothes of the people feel like lead. You see the villagers in the dobe trying to plow the mud, their wooden plows slipping and sliding. They are planting the seeds they managed to save, their movements rhythmic and desperate. They are gambling their last hope on a season that has already been sabotaged by the climate. If the rains do not come, or if they come too fiercely, the Chalisa will claim another year. The sleepy historian remembers the folklore of this period, the songs of the Baramasa that were changed to reflect the year the seasons died. They sang of the Chaitra month that felt like the foothills of the mountains, and of the Baisakhi, where the harvest was nothing but water and weeds. You see a group of wandering singers, their instruments warped by the damp, sitting under a banyan tree. They sing of the Ganges flowing with ice, and the Yamuna weeping for her children. It is a music of survival, a way to process the trauma of a world turned upside down. The wildlife, too, is reacting to the change. The tigers and wolves that had prowled the village outskirts are retreating back into the jungles, but they leave behind a landscape that has been changed. The deer and the antelope have perished in great numbers, and the predators are now turning on each other. You see a leopard in the distance, moving through the high, with grass of the terai, its coat bedraggled and dark. The natural order is trying to reset itself, but the gears are grinding, filled with the sand of the volcanic ash and the silt of the floods. As the evening falls, the air doesn't grow sharp and clear as it did in January. It grows thick and heavy. You hear the first frogs of the season, a low, croaking chorus from the ditches. To anyone else, it might be a sound of life, but to the survivors of 1783, it is the sound of the swamps returning to claim the fields. You see the flickers of fires in the distance, not the small, intense fires of the frost, but large, smoky bonfires where the people are burning the debris of the winter. The smoke rises lazily, joining the gray clouds, a smudge on the soul of the country. You sit on a stone wall, watching the water drip from a carved lion's head. You feel a sense of profound exhaustion. The journey through the frost was a journey through a world of iron, but the journey through the thaw is a journey through a world of ghosts. Every puddle seems to hold a memory of the ice. Every muddy footprint tells a story of a struggle that is only just beginning to ease. The sleepy historian whispers that history is not made of great events, but of these quiet, sodden moments of endurance. We are nearing the end of our 4-hour vigil. The sun is setting behind the clouds, casting a dim, pearlescent light over the city of Delhi. The fires are being lit, the evening prayers are being said, and the people are settling in for another night. It is not as cold as it was, but the chill is still there, lurking in the shadows and the damp corners of the heart. We have seen the winter of 1783, from its first violet twilight to its muddy, gasping end. We have walked with the emperor, the merchants, the farmers, and the ghosts. But before we close the book, we must look forward. What will the summer of 1784 bring? Will the heat return with a vengeance? Or will the dry fog return to choke the sun once more? The sleepy historian knows the answer, but for now, he is content to let you sit in the quiet of the thaw. Take a breath. The air is heavy, but it is no longer the breath of a volcano. It is the breath of India, battered, bruised, and shivering, but still alive. Stay with me for the final part of our journey, where we will see the first green shoots of a true recovery, and reflect on the legacy of the winter that changed the face of the subcontinent. The water continues to drip, the river continues to roar, and the story of the frost over the Ganges draws toward its final, bittersweet conclusion. By the time May of 1784 finally arrived, the sun had at last begun to reclaim its throne over the plains of Hindustan, but it was a sun that looked down upon a changed world. We reached the final stage of our journey now, walking through a landscape that is no longer white with frost or gray with mud, but is instead a parched, dusty canvas of recovery and remembrance. You feel the heat, the true, familiar Indian heat, beginning to bake the earth, turning the deep ruts of the spring's quagmire into hard, permanent scars. The sleepy historian, in your notes that while the ice had melted, the winter of 1783 had carved itself into the very DNA of the land, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt the Mughal administration and the rising British Raj for decades to come. You walk through the streets of Delhi one last time, and the atmosphere is a strange blend of relief and mourning. The dry fog has finally dissipated, replaced by the familiar shimmering haze of the pre-monsoon summer. You see the merchants in Chandni Chowk reopening their stalls, but the goods they display are meager. The fine muslins are gone, replaced by coarse homespun. The heaps of spices are smaller, and the chatter of the marketplace has a subdued, cautious quality. People move with a certain hesitancy, as if they are still waiting for the ground to betray them again, or for the air to turn to needles once more. You see a group of children playing near a fountain that finally flows with liquid water. They laugh, but their laughter is thin, a fragile sound in a city that has forgotten how to be loud. Can you feel the weight of the absence? It is the most striking thing about the post-winter world. There are gaps in the crowds, empty houses in every neighborhood, and a silence in the villages that no amount of bird call can fill. The Chalisa famine had done its work. You see the sleepy historian checking his ledgers, noting that in some districts, nearly half the population had vanished, some to the grave, others to the distant, greener lands of the east and south. This was the year that changed the map of India not through war, but through the slow, cold attrition of the climate. The power of the Mughal Empire, already a flickering flame, had been further dimmed. How can one rule a people who have seen the very heavens turn against them? You move toward the outskirts of the city, where the great banyan trees stand. These giants, which we saw clicking with ice just months ago, are now putting out new leaves, a vibrant, waxy green that seems almost too bright against the dusty brown of the fields. But if you look closely at the bark, you see the frost canker, the deep splits in the wood where the sap had frozen and burst. These are the scars of 1783, marks that the trees will carry until they fall. You see a group of villagers gathered under the shade, sharing a small communal meal of flatbread and salt. They tell stories of the year of the Iron Ground, turning the trauma into folklore, ensuring that the memory of the frost will be passed down to those who were not there to shiver through it. The sleepy historian muses on the global echoes of this winter. Far across the oceans, the same volcanic ash that choked the Ganges had brought a year without a summer to Europe and North America, sparking bread riots in France and crop failures in the colonies. But here, in the shadow of the Himalayas, the impact was uniquely devastating because it struck at the heart of a civilization built on the predictability of the sun. You see the British officers of the East India Company in their bungalows, writing their reports with a mixture of detachment and opportunism. They noted that the famine had lowered the price of land and broken the power of local chieftains, clearing the way for a new, more rigid kind of empire. The frost, in its own way, had been a pioneer for the Raj. As the afternoon sun reaches its zenith, you find yourself back at the banks of the Yamuna, The river is low now, a silver ribbon winding through a vast expanse of sand and silt. The ice is a distant memory, but the riverbanks are still littered with the bleached bones of the cattle that perished in the deep freeze. You see a boatman pushing his craft into the water, his muscles corded and dark against his white dhoti. He sings a low, mournful song about the daughter of the sun, a song that acknowledges both her beauty and her cruelty. The river flows on, indifferent to the tragedies that played out on its banks, a constant reminder of the eternal return, the cycle of destruction and rebirth that defines the history of the subcontinent. You see a funeral pyre being lit on the Ghats. The smoke rises straight and blue into the clear sky, no longer trapped by the heavy air of a sulfur cloud. It is a clean fire, a fire that marks the end of a long, cold vigil. You feel a sense of closure, but also a lingering melancholy. The winter of 1783 was a reminder of our vulnerability, a moment when the cosmic and the local collided to remind us that we are all guests on a temperamental planet. The fires of Delhi were never warm enough to stop the frost, but the internal fire, the resilience of the human spirit, was enough to see the city through to the dawn. The sleepy historian begins to pack away his scrolls. He reminds you that history is not just a collection of dates and names, but a sensory experience. The smell of the sulfur, the sound of the cracking ice, the taste of the dusty wind. As we prepare to leave this narrative journey, you take one last look at the Red Fort. Its sandstone walls are glowing in the late afternoon light, a deep, warm red that seems to radiate the heat of the sun. It has survived the Mongols, the Persians, the Marathas, and now the Great Frost. It stands as a monument to endurance, a silent witness to the seasons of man and the whims of the gods. You walk away from the river, heading back toward the present day, but you carry the chill of 1783 in your bones. You have seen the ghostly Ghats and the iron earth. You have sat with the emperor and the starving farmer. You have learned that even in the darkest, coldest winter, there's a seed of spring waiting to emerge, even if it is a spring marked by scars and empty bowls. The sleepy historian gives you a tired, knowing smile and a slight nod. The story is told, the hours have passed, and the ice has finally, completely, melted into the mud of the Ganges. As the stars begin to appear in the twilight, soft, twinkling lights now, no longer the screaming chips of ice from the midwinter. You feel a sense of peace. The world is back in balance, or at least as balanced as it ever is. The monsoon will come soon, washing away the last of the volcanic ash and the dust of the famine, bringing a new cycle of life to the plains. But for those who lived through the winter of 1783, the world would never be quite the same. They would always look at a violet sunset or a sudden autumn chill with a flicker of recognition, a memory of the time when the riverbanks froze and the fires of Delhi never seemed warm enough. We leave them there, in the deepening shadows of the 18th century, a people rebuilding their world one brick, one grain, one breath at a time. The sleepy historian closes his eyes, his voice trailing off into a whisper. The journey is over. The frost is gone. The sun has returned. And we, the witnesses, are left with the memory of a winter that was also a revelation of the strength that lies hidden in the heart of a cold, shivering world. Rest now, as the echoes of the Ganges fade into the night. The story is complete, and the history of the frost is written in the stars and the soil of India.